Episode 131, Recognizing Trauma in Your Body with Cami Birdo.
Welcome to Latter-day Life Coaches, the podcast where each episode is a conversation between me, Heather Rackham, and one of my amazing coach colleagues. Each coach here is a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and a highly trained, experienced life coach making a great impact in the lives of their clients. And together, we have one main goal, helping you live your best life no matter what. You ready for this conversation with the coach? Here we go.
When we came to Earth, we began our journey of mortality by getting a body. Our body and spirit start to experience all the joys and pains of living life as a human being. All of us, in one way or the other, will experience situations that can be classified as trauma. The body's response to these situations is the way God designed it to be, so that the body can protect us as needed. However, as you will hear Coach Cami Birdo speak about today, trauma is never meant to stay in the body. Yet so many of us hold onto it and carry this unnecessary burden through our lives. Cami wants everyone to know that there are ways to release trauma and find the healing you deserve. The subject of trauma is a big one, and Cami has so much knowledge to share that this podcast is a two-part series. In today's episode, you will hear Cami and Heather speaking about trauma, what it is, and the effects it has on the body. In next week's episode, Cami will be here on a solo podcast going over all the tools you can use to help heal from trauma. Whoever you are, given that you are a human being with a body, you will have trauma, so everyone needs to listen to this episode. It is very enlightening and contains a lot of content never discussed here before. Please enjoy, and then sign up to work with Cami to find healing from your own traumas.
Hey, y'all. Welcome to the podcast today. I am joined by another amazing coach. I am always, just before we get started, so impressed with the caliber of people who are working in this field. And I get to talk with another one today. So I'm joined today by Coach Cami Birdo. Hey, Cami.
Hello.
Hey.
I'm happy to be here.
Thank you so much for being here. And I'm excited for this topic of conversation today. But like always, before we get started, I want to have you introduce yourself. So I'm going to just throw it back to you and let you share a little bit.
Sure. Yeah. So I am Cami Birdo. I live in Flagstaff, Arizona. I have 6 kids and my husband, and we live in the mountains of Arizona, and it's perfect for us because we're total outdoor people who love to get out. And it's great because we have our perfect weather. And in the winter, when we have tons of snow, we can go down to Sedona or down to Phoenix area and get the sunshine. And so we just love where we're at. We love that we have trails right outside our back door and can hike and do all the things. And we love to just be out in nature. And that's my happy place. That's where I get all my fulfillment. And it's been a huge part of me healing. And actually, that is how I became a coach. And so basically what we're talking about today is how I became a coach, because I had tons of trauma that I had suppressed, didn't even know I had until about 4 years ago. And then as it started to surface and I realized I needed help is when I already had mindset. I already had coaching in my background, right? And so I was like, oh, this is helpful. And I'll kind of talk about that in the podcast, but that's kind of what led me to coaching. And that's why I'm here. So,
oh, thank you so much for sharing that. And it sounds like, I mean, I live in Idaho, you're in Arizona, but we should be neighbors because it sounds like we enjoy all the same things.
Yes.
So fun. I love all things outside the mountains as well. I'm ready. I'm itching. Like it sounds like it's easier for you to get into the warmer weather than for me, but it's been the perpetual winter around here.
It's so, yeah.
Okay.
Love it.
So Cami, you call yourself a trauma-informed embodiment coach. Do you want to expand upon that a little bit?
Yeah. So trauma-informed, there's kind of 2 parts of it for me, right? The basic part is just that it means that you have trauma education. I've gone to, taken lots of classes and courses from like the main gurus of trauma right now, like Bessel van der Kolk from Body Keeps the Score and Peter Levine and Gabor Mate, just a bunch of people who have really been studying trauma and how it affects our body and the physiological, biological stuff that goes on in our body. And so just getting trauma education and information about that. And there's tons available nowadays, which is so awesome. And then the other part is that I've lived it. I've lived with having trauma in my body. And so not only do I have all this information about trauma and how it affects your body, but I know personally, and it helps me in that way because then I can see signs a little bit easier in my clients, or when they say certain phrases, or, me just asking them, how is your body feeling right now? I'm able to catch in on those clues because I've been there. And then the embodiment part kind of goes back into what I was talking about with coaching first, right? When there is so much, and getting trauma education is so much about the mindset and understanding. And for me, it was huge because I didn't know that there was all this information. I didn't know what my body was doing. So to have information and understanding was a huge part of it. It helped me get out of, you have these trauma narratives that are your beliefs that are actually coping mechanisms that are connected to your trauma that you don't even know that you have until coaching for me started to open up this new window of like, oh, wait, I can think about this differently. Oh, wait, why am I thinking about it this way? Right. And so that was so helpful, but it doesn't help when like trauma is stored in your body. And your body, just like the book, it really does keep the score of all the trauma, and it tucks it away at different spots of your body, and it'll come up at random times that you have no control over. And so I started to realize that I couldn't heal this with just mindset alone, right? I needed to be able to get into my body. And so that is where the embodiment starts to come. And being able for me then, as I was taking those different summits and courses and classes, I would hear people talk about this bottom up, this things happening in your body. And I'm like, what does that even mean? And let me research. And when they're saying you can use this modality or this modality to heal, and I would just kind of go with whatever one spoke to me. As I would hear somebody talking about it, I would learn more about it. I would take a class. And then if it really spoke to me, I would then take another one that was more involved and be able to start embodying it and integrating it so that I could really learn to release all that trapped trauma. And so some of my favorite modalities that have really helped me and that I like to offer to my clients is the somatic experiencing by Peter Levine, polyvagal theory by Steve Porges, chakra work, which is connected to all sorts of different yoga, right? And then inner child work, which is a lot of like, lots of people call it ego work or parts work or family systems. All of that is kind of embedded in this inner child work that I do because I've done different classes in all of those, and I like to just kind of lump it all in there. And then we'll be doing another podcast where I'll kind of go into more depth of those. But for me, that's been really helpful in being able to add both of those pieces because I couldn't let the trauma go until I was able to embody some of those things, and embody then letting go the trauma and then embodying the new belief system and the new way of thinking and filling my body back. Because in trauma, you get fragmented. Like it feels as if different pieces of you are just kind of torn apart and you can't find them. And then when you start to release stuff, there's a void. And so then lots of times we just kind of bring some of that back in, or we do the things that are most comfortable because we have this void. So these trauma modalities and healings help to fill that void, help us learn how to call back the parts of ourselves that were lost or that we shoved down because of trauma, and to call back our inner selves and our inner wisdom to fill that void and to like, it was always there or maybe kind of outside of us, and to like bring it back into us. And so it's powerful, it's fulfilling, it's amazing work. So
awesome. Parts of us probably that we imagine and probably feel like we'll never be able to get back. Absolutely. And parts of us that we desperately miss all at the same time. So what powerful work there. I think it is important that you did talk about mindset work. For many people, that is like the easiest and the first step, the introduction into a transformation in some way, because you really do start to see that you have choice in so many things that you didn't think that you had a choice in. But like you said, it is just the foot in the door. There's so much beyond that it is so important to continue to learn and to grow. And we have so many resources.
Yeah, so true. I'm so grateful we have so many.
Oh, for sure. For sure. Okay. So trauma affects everybody. I know that.
Right.
And I guess part of me is like, it's a word that we hear so much of anymore, trauma, that there's one part of me that's like, okay, are we, by the constant talk about trauma, are we creating like trauma that's not there, which I know is not true, but I know that people can think that too, right?
Yeah.
Like
Oh,
there's got to be
absolutely.
this balance, but it does affect everybody.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And I think there's also, in starting to recognize that, there's a phrase that lots of people will use, meaning like big T trauma and little T trauma, right? And so like the big T is like things that everybody would say, oh yeah, of course that's a traumatic experience. Of course that happened to you and you have trauma from that. And even those though is amazing, because like people can be in like a traumatic experience, and one person will have way more trauma than another person, or a different type of trauma from the exact same experience, right? So it really goes to show that trauma is really just the state of our body, meaning like the experiences that we've had in our past and how our body understands, and the perspective that we have based on the trauma that is kind of placed before us. So actually, even like the traumatic experience, quote unquote, that you would say traumatic, where the trauma actually comes is how our body responds to that experience. And so there's where you say like, where people, sometimes are like, hold on a minute, are we just labeling too many things trauma? I think that is where the subtlety of the little T trauma comes in, because the little T are the ones that like, it's really hard to pinpoint, okay, that was the traumatic experience. It's more like a sequence of things. It's easier for us to minimize. It's easier for us to say, well, mine wasn't as bad as so-and-so's, or like, we can see that like, maybe this happened to us and it wasn't okay, but we're like, but it wasn't that bad. I should just get over it. I should just, and so those are types of, I think, mindsets that start to like pull us away from, and like even justify, like when we see somebody else having quote unquote trauma and we don't think they should be because it's a little thing, it could be like, kind of prodding onto our little T's of like, wait, how come they get to say it and I don't think that I can, right? And so it's kind of like, we kind of throw it back, but each person's like fight response is going to look different. Your flee response is going to look different. Your freeze, your fawn response is going to look totally different. And so there really is not a hierarchy, because even if there's big T and little t, like our body doesn't know the difference. Our body is going to respond with trauma no matter what our meaning frames or what society dictates as being more traumatic than the other. Like our body does not know the difference. We will cope with it however our body knows how to cope. And our nervous system is not bad what it offers us, right? It really, and starting to learn that. But it can also be, I think one of the big things is just starting to recognize when your body responds in a way that like maybe you'll hear a certain phrase or a certain word, or you'll smell something, or you'll see something. Sometimes there are like flashbacks that come back to you in memories, and sometimes it is just your body will respond in a way that you're like, wait a minute, like, where did that come from? That it seems they're overreactive or out of control. Like those are just, your body is letting you know there's trauma here, and it's information is all it is. So
I think that it's so interesting that comparing ourselves to other people gets us into so much trouble in so many aspects of our lives. And it does even here, right? In this trauma umbrella, in discussion around trauma, still comparison creeps in, and it creates such chaos for us that that's so not helpful.
Right. It just hinders us, right? In all areas. And it's the same here. Yeah.
Okay. So you talked about, I heard you say flee, freeze, and fawn.
Yes.
Do you want to expand on those a little bit for listeners?
Yeah, for sure. So, the fight response is, the basic, like, hey, I'm in danger. My body's going to respond in a certain way. And it really depends on the person, right? There are some people who get angry and get mean and get really, like you can tell, oh, they're fighting. And there's other people who get more of this internal fight going on. They just kind of like puff themselves up a little bigger. They have to be better than everybody else in their talking, or know about everything compared to everyone else, right? They have to be smarter. Sometimes perfectionism can come in the fight response of like letting everybody know that I'm perfect in all these areas and I'm on top of everything, right? And so it's kind of noticing like, are these things that I'm doing, is it stemming from trauma? There's the flee response, which again is the obvious, like, I need to get out of here, like you physically move. There's also the flee response of, I'm just going to shrink within myself and I'm not going to be present. I'm going to withdraw. There's dissociation that comes with that, right? Where like you really do feel like a part of you is kind of watching, has come outside of you and is just kind of watching the experience. That is a flee response as well. And then there is the fawn response, which this one is a little trickier. Actually, before that, let me explain the freeze, which I guess lots of people know that too, right? That you will just completely shut down. So it comes sometimes the fight and the flee are more energy wise, right? They come from the sympathetic part. So there's energy involved with them. So even if you're going to flee within, right? Sometimes you will then next go to freeze. So you'll flee within and hide from everybody else. And then you're going to kind of hide from yourself and you're going to freeze and not pay attention. You're going to numb out, like you can't get into your feelings. That was one thing with mindset coaching when I first started learning about life coaching and they started talking about feelings, because my go-to nervous system response is freeze. And like, I could not get into my body. I could not feel when they said like, what's happening in your body when you feel angry? I'm like, I have no idea. Like I was cut off from here down. It was all numb. Right. And then there's also like you physically freeze sometimes, right? Like especially victims of assault or, physical violence, medical violence, lots of that. There is like a physical freeze that will then, if you're triggered in certain areas, it comes up in your present and your body will freeze again. So it is like this uncontrollable response. And then the fawn is when you've kind of frozen inside, meaning that like you're not acting as your true self, but you're still in some form of sympathetic energy. Like nobody would know that you were in freeze because you're able to talk and you're able to pay attention and you know exactly what to say this person to keep yourself safe. You know exactly how to stay away or navigate your environment or navigate this person to keep yourself safe. And so it's a very people-pleasy type of response. And so that's what the fawn is where you're kind of like jumping back and forth, but you're not true to yourself. So that's often when you're in a situation where you're like, why did I just do that? Like, that's not who I really am. Why did I just say that? I would never really say that. Why did I respond that way? Right. A lot of that comes from that fawn response.
Okay. So. Thank you for explaining that. It was the fawn that I hadn't heard a whole lot of use of that phrase before. So I'm glad you expanded upon that.
Yeah. And I'm really glad that it hasn't been very long that they've put that now into the nervous system trauma responses. And all of us who have been through trauma are like, thank you. Like we're finally being seen, right? That really is a big response for so many trauma victims.
I was going to say it probably is a lot more common. And if people are continuing to act normally, quote unquote, then we wouldn't know. And so no wonder, like, it just makes sense that we haven't heard a whole lot about it. But yeah, glad that probably with the more awareness of that, the more people are able to be like, oh yeah, like I am being affected by this in some way.
And especially with like when you're using those subtle little T traumas, there's a lot of fawning that goes on in that, right? That's where there's so much minimizing, is because it's like, but I'm fine. I can function normally. There's just that one thing, that I do this. And every once in a while I just get triggered in this, and that's where a lot of like the complex trauma and the developmental childhood trauma, there's a lot of fawning that goes on in there that people don't know and don't realize and don't get help because that fawning response is so big in those spaces.
Okay.
All right. And a lot of religious and spiritual trauma too. There's tons of that goes on in there too.
One of the things you mentioned also earlier was bottom up, top down. There we go. I think I got it right there. Yeah. Do you want to explain a little bit more about that as well?
Yeah. And so this is where it's so powerful to start, because trauma healing looks so different for everybody. Like you come in lots of times, and I did it first too. I'm like, I just want somebody to tell me exactly how to do it. Give me the steps, right? But we're all so different, and our trauma is also different, and how our body responds to it is also differently. And so I love to I break it down into 3 areas actually. So top down, bottom up, and then a sideways. And the reason I do that is because it starts to give a little bit of a framework to do this, right? So that you don't feel so overwhelmed. You don't feel like, well, where do I work next, right? It's starting to help us see that like we can be grounded. And what I work with my clients very first is helping them to center and ground so that they can have safety, because you can't heal trauma until your body is safe, until you've created safety in your environment. And so part of that is the top down would be meaning mindset, right? So it would be starting to learn trauma education, learn that like your body is responding in a normal way. that your nervous system is not good or bad, like those type of things, starting to change narratives and make it so that it's safe for you to start thinking something different. And then again, the safety of the bottom up is very first is starting to gain grounding tools, like physically grounding your body, like being able to start to be present. Like for people who dissociate or people who freeze, or even people who go into the fight and the flee, all of it is running away from self. Right. And so it's starting to like do simple, basic tools that I can use in any of those modalities that I mentioned, right? And I like to offer my clients different ones because some maybe only want to do somatic, some only want to do polyvagal, some want a combo of all, right? And so it's starting to recognize, how does my body feel grounded and present? What does it even mean to feel my feet on the floor? And can I actually physically feel my feet on the floor? Can I look around and center myself in the space that I am? Can I look at right angles? Can I, so there's all sorts of different tools. And it's starting to be able to, first you do those with your brain, right? With the mindset, being able to center so that when you have a trigger or something come up, you can be like, oh, okay, this is something coming from the bottom. I'm going to first take a deep breath and breathe. Breath work is basically the very first one that you start with, and be able to be like, okay, I have a body. This is my body, right? And starting to ground. And then you start to build capacity of safety in your body. And then you can do more tools that are really focused all in the body. So that's why it's bottom up, because you really are paying attention to what is going on in your body to be able to release things. And then the third one is starting to gain safety around how you view yourself. So that's why I kind of call it the sideways, because we have thoughts about, am I doing my mindset work right? Thoughts about, am I doing my body work right? Why isn't this going away? When will this ever leave? Right. And so that's kind of like paying attention, like, how am I viewing myself? Am I judgmental? Am I mean? What's my inner critic going on? Am I able to find any sort of grace and kindness for myself? What's going on here? Because lots of times this sideways will stop the bottom up, right? Like if you are working so hard to get safety in your body, and then you have this thought of like, well, you'll never get there, or you've never been able to do this before, right? It kind of stops that trust that you're trying to develop in your body of being able to honor yourself and start to get to know yourself. And so that part is really important to just pay attention and know where we're stopping ourselves. So does that make sense?
Yeah, it totally does on so many different levels. And for me, I relate a lot with that sideways. I know that I haven't really had a whole lot of big T trauma that I've needed to work through, but just in general, being able to be kind to myself and have compassion and be aware of the things that I think about me has been very influential in my ability to just actually do anything and moving forward in any sort of areas that I'm wanting to work on.
Right. It is. It's amazing how powerful that sideways is in helping us or hindering us, right?
Absolutely.
Sure.
So can you give us some clues for people who are listening today that that people like might be able to recognize some of these signs or some of these struggles in themselves?
Yeah, for sure. And before I give a few clues, I want to just kind of give a little bit of info about our body's ability to suppress and repress. Okay. Meaning our body has these defense mechanisms. So if it is not safe for us to work through trauma that we've had, like if it's not safe, either our environment isn't safe, maybe we have some toxic relationships, or maybe we're too toxic to ourselves, right? Our body is not going to offer up trauma until we've created some safety. And so its defense mechanism in doing that then is to suppress and repress the trauma until we're finally in a safe place. So that's why for me, like mindset work was so valuable, because it finally got me in a place where I was safe. Like I physically was safe in my mind. And then my body was like, okay, maybe she's going to like love us. Maybe there's a possibility that we could offer something in the body. Right. And so the word suppress is that there is like a conscious effort. So say like, because there were times in my past where I would have like a weird memory or a weird thought come up about either some of my perpetrators or about maybe some of the developmental trauma that I had in my home, or with the religious trauma that I had with church, right? And so I would have some of these things come up, and then I would just think I was crazy. Like, there is no way that that could be real. Like, why would I even come up that I must be a bad person for thinking this or for having this come up? And then I didn't want to think about me being this terrible person. There's no way I was going to tell anybody. So I'm just going to shove that back down. Right. So there is kind of this conscious awareness of like, and it might, you might not even have all of those thoughts come through. It just pops in and you're like, that's scary. Pop that down. Right. And so that's suppression, where there is some conscious, deliberate, I can't deal with that right now, and we're going to tuck it back away. And then the repression is more of an unconscious thing. So that is more like, there were so many things that happened to me that never came back to my memory until I started doing trauma work, because they were so, my body could not handle the pain and the emotional response that came up with it. And so my body repressed them where there was no memory of it whatsoever. It was so unconscious. And so that happens a lot with childhood trauma. It happens a lot, with so many different abuses that are something that is so traumatic. And actually all those complex traumas of like these little things that happen over and over and over, like you just repress those because they don't make sense, especially as a little kid. None of it makes sense. So your little kid brain and body just represses all of it. The way then, so once we just kind of have this background of our body's ability to suppress and repress. So then kind of when you, some telltale signs that possibly maybe I could consider this as trauma. And it doesn't mean every time, right? But like, say you behave, it's kind of what we were talking about before. You have actions or words that you're like, wait a minute, like that's not who I really am, but you feel like it's uncontrollable. Like it just happens, right? And no matter, especially when we're doing mindset work, right? We know about the unintentional models and the intentional models. When you keep having this unintentional that comes up, no matter how many times you've worked on it, that could be because there's something related to trauma in that you cannot control it because it's your nervous system coming online. And so there's different ways to heal that nervous system. So that's not the response, right? There is also, like I was talking about before, the visceral body responses. And that is literally like, I had a friend who was telling me, I was sitting there and somebody said this word, and that word caused my heart. She's like, I didn't have a memory. I didn't have a flashback. And it was just the word, but my heart started racing. And she's like, I've heard that word before, but it was somehow in the context of where I was at, and my palms got all sweaty. And all I wanted to do was just get up and run and get out of there, but I couldn't. I was frozen, or even like when you feel this over desire to fight, or, so when you start to notice that you're going into any of those 4 nervous system responses with your body, that you're like, wait, there is no logic. Like I can look around and there's no danger here. There's no reason I should be going into this, but my body is responding in some sort of way that I can't control. That's a good thing to start being aware of. Sometimes, again, like those big emotions that we're afraid to go to, whether it's anxiety, anger, depression, sadness, when there are emotions that you're afraid to go to because you feel like they control you, they take over you. Like as soon as you go there, you feel like you're going to be swallowed in them. That's kind of a telltale sign too, because the way that we work with trauma is we don't go directly into it. So our bodies know. We work like chipping away at it, little bits by little bits. We go in, we come out, we go in, we come out, and we create safety. So when your body has this overwhelming emotion and is like, no way are we going there, that's a telltale sign that your nervous system is like, you're going headlong into trauma, and that is not safe, and we're not going to do that. So when you find yourself really resistant to that, sometimes it's those people pleasing and perfectionism, right? Some of those. And when you feel it's like, not only I just know that I do that, but like it's necessary. Like I have to do this to survive. That's kind of a clue. When you find that you're like drawn to trauma education, right? Like I really feel drawn to wanting to learn about this, right? That's another sign. There's physical symptoms in your body, like lots of the autoimmune diseases. Even they found most of preventable diseases have some root of somebody has trauma that is causing their body to like, say, especially if like they've tried to offer things, things have come up, that whole suppression, and we just keep shoving it down. Our body's like, I got to get this out of me somehow. So it's going to come out in the form of disease and illness, or in these aches and pains that like never go away, or only come up when you're around your family, or only come up, when you're doing this certain thing. And then I think for another one, the big one is like, if you have a really hard time getting out of black and white thinking or all or nothing, that is a really big sign too that you have trauma, because our nervous system needs black and white, right? The nervous system is so like, I will protect you. There is this thing to do or this thing to do. Like it's very, I come online, I do this thing. And so that's the only option. So when you find that you cannot get out of that in a certain space or around a certain topic, there could be trauma around there too. So.
Okay. Yeah. My mind is just like searching, right? It like starts to search all the things. And
yes.
Yeah, there's so much great information there. One thing that I will mention, you did talk about one of the coaching tools that you and I and many people teach is the coaching model as taught by Brooke Castillo, and like intentional and unintentional models. Some people might not know what that is. So we'll be sure to link to an episode of the podcast that talks about that, because I do think that is a really, it's such an interesting thing to take a look at, right? Like we have thoughts about circumstances in our lives, but there's so much that happens between the circumstance in our lives. And like, we have so much society, social beliefs and religious beliefs and family conditioning and religious conditioning that shapes how we think about things, that we do have to, we got to do some work there too. That's what helps us to see. But anyway, not to sidetrack any of those things.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And I think that's also super powerful to start to recognize, just as like people's models and their unintentional can look so different from somebody else's, right? Like what you're thinking about a situation can be so different from somebody else's, just really goes to show how trauma affects us, right? Like, so for instance, I was talking to one of my friends and I was sharing with her that this specific phrase from church is always super trauma invoking for me. And like, when I was sharing it with her, she's like, that is so fascinating because I never even understood it that way. Right. And it was good for me to be like, oh, you mean there's a possibility to not even think about it that way? And then to realize, oh, it was because of my trauma that I'd already had and that I understood it that way. And then it just kind of like piled on to the trauma and just added to the trauma. Right. Yeah. And so I think that is so fascinating and goes to show that like, it really is the state of our body and our mind and where we're at as to whether it's trauma invoking.
Which I'm so glad you brought up, because some people in that instant would be like, well, you can choose to just think something differently about this then, right? If you have a choice, then you can just choose to think something different. And that can be really almost a dangerous expression in and of itself, because for you didn't feel like you have a choice, right? Your body has conditioned itself to respond in a certain way. And so yes, there are certain tools we can use, but also sometimes those tools can backfire if we don't explore other options to go along with that.
Right. And it can be, if it is centered in trauma or there is some link to trauma there, it actually is more trauma inducing and actually creates more trauma. It doesn't heal the trauma. It doesn't help the trauma. It actually makes it worse. Right. And so being able to know that, like, that's why being trauma informed is so powerful, to be like, hold on a minute, like what's going on in your body? Like what's happening here, to be like, is this trauma or is it? Because literally you cannot choose to think a different thought about it until you've healed some of it, because your nervous system is so good at protecting you. It will not let you think something different until you start to heal some of it and give it safety first. Yeah. And then there's a possibility.
Yeah. Which is the good news and the bad news, right? Because people, what they don't understand is your body is working. They get so upset. I should be able to do this differently. And your body is working exactly the way it's designed to. It is designed to help you. And it just doesn't know the difference between physical and emotional pain. So it wreaks all sorts of havoc for us.
Right.
Continue to fight against it. Okay. So share with us the effects that trauma can have on our mind and our body and our spirit. And I know people have maybe been able to infer some of these things by listening to this conversation, but I think just hearing some of them straightforwardly is helpful.
Yeah. So I think one of the big things is just starting to recognize that it really isn't a woo-woo thing, right? Like they have done studies that like it biologically changes your body. Like it biologically changes your brain chemistry. Like the amygdala gets so much bigger in people who have had trauma. And when you heal the trauma, your amygdala goes back down to normal size, right? And there's like so many things within your body, especially if there's generational trauma. Like it really is a thing that like people's DNA can carry trauma. And then when it gets healed, like they've done studies and seen that the DNA looks like this. And then when they heal their trauma, the DNA is no longer there. And so, you can actually like carry it and pass it on. But I think it's a beautiful thing that even in this, like, because I know that I have passed on trauma to my kids. I know I've got trauma from my family, but it's also amazing to know that like I can change it now in my present. My kids can change it now in their present. But it is powerful to know, like, again, like I'm not making this up, right? Like biologically, my body is changing and it has changed. And, there's also a part I think in that is gives us a space to grieve the loss, gives us a space to grieve that developmentally I wasn't able to learn some of those things because my survival was in such a high gear that so I don't need to beat myself up when I'm just now learning them at 45, something that I could have learned in my teens or in my 20s, right? And so I think it gives us a space for grace. It gives us a space for the sideways to come in and offer some kindness to all that judgment and that inner critic as we start to know the biological piece. And it also is amazing when we physically like can start to feel healing change our body. Like that's phenomenal to have these sensations in our body that are different. Like I literally feel different about trauma and about certain parts of my trauma than I did even 2 or 3 years ago, like in my body, which I think is so amazing and so powerful. There's also the effects of trauma. And we've kind of, like you said, talked about this a little bit, but it really does skew our beliefs, and it skews it in a way that like certain things we don't question and completely trust because of coping tools. And we actually should question those things and we shouldn't trust them, right? And then it kind of goes on the flip side too. Again, like where I was talking about the black and white, right? There's kind of either or. Either people who have trauma either are completely trusting, they don't question anything, or they're hypervigilant and they question everything and they don't trust anyone or anything, right? And so again, those starting to recognize that it skews those. It doesn't give place for the ands that are so beautiful and the boths that are so beautiful, and to leave space for diversity and, this tolerance of openness, like that is not available to someone who has this biological effect of trauma. Another big thing is that we get very afraid of our bodies, and because we don't understand the trauma and it's scary, we don't trust ourselves. So literally, like I was terrified of what my body was going to offer. Like, and my body, I remember when I was at my peak of having trauma responses, like I would shake uncontrollably. And I was scared of why I was shaking. I would try to hide my hands. I would wear big clothes so that people couldn't see the physical shakes in my body. And I was scared to death and terrified of why my body was doing that I would never be able to make it stop, that it would just always control me. And so in that space, like I didn't trust my body. I didn't trust the information my brain was giving me. So there's just these floodgates that we're so afraid of. And so we just live with fear of our bodies, fear of everybody else's bodies, right? All of it is just a scary place. And then there's the other thing I think that is super damaging is that it affects our innate knowing of our goodness and replaces it with this innate, I'm bad, I'm less than, I'm not good enough, I'm broken, and not really like just this, like, I think these things, but like they're ingrained. Like everything that you do comes back to the fact that I'm bad. I'm responsible for everything. Nothing ever good can happen to me. It'll happen for everybody else, but not me. And that innate belief that you're bad instead of the innate goodness really wreaks havoc with relationship with God and deity. And it gets really complicated. It can also be really complicated if you have perpetrators, right? And if they're male or female, and if it's a mother or father figure, and that relationship with deity then can get really messy and complicated. And it just, like I was saying before, just you feel like you have the rug pulled out from under you and pieces of you have just been pulled apart and you're fragmented and you just don't feel whole. Everything just kind of seems out there and there's no centering, there's no integration. You just feel like a mess all the time. So I would say those are some of the big effects.
Yeah. And I want to offer too that, you shared one of your, like the shaking, the uncontrollable shaking. And some people listening might be like, well, that doesn't happen to me. So clearly I'm not experiencing any effects from trauma. And no, I don't want anybody to hear that and think, well, then it must not be me, because that could be just unique to you. The way that they are experiencing trauma in their life could be completely different. So I think it is
definitely.
This is one story that we're getting to hear. And I'm so glad that
Right.
Cami is sharing her story. But
Yes.
you as a listener, your story could be completely different. And
Right. And also knowing that like there's different phases, right? That was like kind of like the peak for me. I needed that because I wasn't going to get help until it was obvious to everybody else that I needed help. Right. So for me, my body knew that I needed this shaking, this outward manifest of people seeing that was embarrassing, that I maybe needed to do something about that. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And now it's more like the effects of trauma that come now are more inward, where I'm like, I don't like how I show up with my kids or my husband or my friend in this way. And I don't like that I can't stop saying this, or I don't like that I always respond this way. I think it's amazing that people can get help and look for trauma when it's at that level, where they don't have to wait till it gets so bad for me, that I would finally get help. And so, just really offering, like, if any of these things like resonate with you, definitely like look into it, look and see, and trust yourself, right? Like if your body's like, there might be something here, listen to it, because none of us were ever meant to live in our survival system. Like, I think it's amazing that God gave us that as part of our bodies to help us to get through those traumatic experiences, but we were never meant to stay there. We were never meant to have all of that past experience be lumped into our present. And our bodies are here for us to be present and to experience this mortal journey, right? And we were never meant to live with the trauma, and never meant to have that be our constant friend. So,
and I can't help but think of anybody who's listening who is constantly living in that state, just to hear the hope of that statement, right? We're never meant to stay here forever. And some people feel like there's just like, this just must be my new like normal. I'm just going to have to learn to live with this. And it was never meant to be that way. There is so much that Cami and I could cover. We actually decided that this would be best suited to do in 2 parts, because Cami wants to be able to offer you, the listeners, as much help as she can. And we just didn't feel like we could do it all in one episode. So Cami and I, and before we wind up today, I want to make sure that there's nothing else you want to cover in this episode, but I want you to know that this is going to be 2-part. So there'll be another episode that will be released that is going to cover a lot more. And, but until then, Cami, is there anything else that you feel like we need to share with them today?
I think the biggest thing is just like recognizing that healing from trauma is work. It is hard, right? It does feel overwhelming at times. I do, like I said, love to have that framework of understanding top down, bottom up, sideways. And it's really helpful for me and for my clients when something comes up to be like, oh, where is this coming from? Is it coming from my brain? Is it coming from my body? Is it coming from my sideways? And once I know that, then it's like, oh, I have tools to work in the sideways. I have tools to work in my body. I have tools to work in my brain, right? And so it kind of helps, I wouldn't say ease the hard, but give a framework and a little bit of a structure so that we feel like we're in control again, right? And we have choice, which is so hard in trauma. You feel like your choice is stripped away. So that's so powerful. And it is in that same vein, then it becomes so rewarding when we start to realize I can trust this inner wisdom. I can trust the fact that my body wants to offer me something so that I can let go, so that I can heal. And being able to center and ground just becomes so calming to know, like, I didn't even understand what calm meant until I've learned to calm and regulate my nervous system. And then I'm like, oh, is this how other people live their lives? Like that their nervous system isn't in high gear all the time. And then that's so empowering, right? To know that like my nervous system helps me, and I can kind of check in with my nervous system and be like, is this important now? Do I need this? No, I don't actually. And let's do something else. I'm not going to use that coping tool. Thank you, nervous system, for protecting me so long. And I'm going to use something that's more healthy and more in congruency with my 45-year-old self right now and who I want to be and how I want to show up in this space. And I think that is just so powerful. And there's so many tools, which, I'm so excited to share those in the next episode of tools that kind of offer all of that.
There's so much hope. And I think, in this space where we can talk about our religious beliefs and the things that we all teach professionally, I think when you can combine the two of those, our hope in tools that we can find, and our hope in our Savior, Jesus Christ. There is so much strength and so much power to be found. And
Yes.
thank you for
You are
sharing
so welcome.
that with us today, Cami. I can't wait to hear the rest of it. Thank you to our listeners for being here today. Before we go, Cami is going to share with us where they can find more of you to tide you over until the next episode. So
definitely. Yes. So I have my website, which is camibirdno.com. I have my Instagram and my Facebook, which are Cami Birdo Coaching. And then through my bio, right, or even on my website, there's free resources that I have. My newsletters come out weekly, and I get those, have tons of tips and actionable steps that I offer kind of in each of those modalities, and give ideas and tips and ways for people to apply it to their lives now. I have my coaching programs. I have a podcast, Go All In to Let Go, where I give lots more tips and information. So there's tons of different ways that you can find me and get help that way too.
Awesome.
So.
Thank you so much, Cami. And thank you for those that are listening. I know that healing is not easy. Like you said earlier, it is a process, but anything worth doing, as we've all know, is like it's hard work, and it's not for the faint of heart. It's brave people who are doing this work every day. And so thank you for doing that work, and to all those listening for doing their work, because by doing so, we're changing the world, and we are, we're just making it a better place to be. So thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Heather.
We'll see you again next time. Hey, we just wanted to thank you for spending part of your day here with us at Latter-day Life Coaches and being part of this conversation. Share this with your friends so that you can have a conversation with them on this topic as well. And as always, subscribe so you don't miss a single episode. Have a good one, my friends.